We witnessed an extraordinary moment of diplomatic theatre and strategic vision today as President Emmanuel Macron addressed the assembled MPs and peers in the Royal Gallery of the Palace of Westminster, nothing short of a masterclass in statesmanship, historical awareness, and forward-thinking realism. Would that he were one of the elite politicians in this country. It was no perfunctory speech. It was a statement of intent, a renewal of vows between Britain and France in an era of shifting alliance, security threat, and cultural estrangement. Macron stood beneath the towering paintings of Waterloo and Trafalgar, potent symbols of centuries of conflict, and he chose not to deny the history those canvases represented, but to transcend it. His declaration that we are linked by our geography, by our past, by our common future, offered an explicit rejection of parochialism. The Royal Gallery, so often the scene of polite but forgettable platitudes, instead rang with the language of fraternity, alliance, and urgency. And the President was unafraid to tackle the thorniest issue in the room, the irregular migration across the Channel. He was careful, even tactful, in acknowledging the legitimacy of the hope for a better life, yet he insisted rules must not be flouted by criminal networks exploiting the vulnerable. And most strikingly, he refused to reduce the problem to a bilateral squabble about small boats. Instead, he framed it as a collective European challenge, one that must involve countries of departure and transit. This was sophisticated diplomacy, widening the lens, refusing to scapegoat. And I would expect from the language that he was using that Britain will soon get access to the sort of police records and immigration records that we used to have access to before, so that we can see who has been denied residence in European countries and therefore who should not be given residence in Britain. That is something that we lost with Brexit, and that was a bitter loss. And President Macron reminded Britain that the issue cannot be solved by razor wire on the beaches of Kent alone. Cooperation, solidarity, and firmness were his watchwords, but so too was humanity. And he's right. President Macron's address was above all a call for shared security, not for drafting ridiculous laws that mean nothing. You can't call somebody an illegal migrant when actually international law defines them as perfectly legal. He invoked the spectre of aggressive nuclear powers and hesitating alliances, a veiled criticism of America's isolationist drift under Trump and of Russia's belligerence. And of course, it's Ukraine that has brought Britain and Macron together. His proposal that France and Britain lead Europe in raising defense spending to 3.5% of GDP was audacious. It was a challenge to NATO complacency and a demand for a genuinely European pillar of defense. He anchored this in history, evoking Winston Churchill as a visionary who recognized the need for a transatlantic alliance, while insisting that today's task is to strengthen Europe's own capacity. And he laid flowers in front of the statue of Winston Churchill. Macron didn't shy away from the most contentious crises of our time. On Ukraine, he drew rousing applause by vowing Europe would never abandon its ally, pointedly condemning Russian aggression as an assault on the entire international order. On Gaza, he was equally clear. He called for an unconditional ceasefire and insisted that the recognition of a Palestinian state was the only path to peace. Thank God for someone like Macron, who recognizes that a ceasefire is linked to a peace effort. The two things go together. You can't have one without the other. This was statesmanship in the old mold, and it's a shame that so many twits in the present British House of Commons have simply cannot aspire to this level of statesmanship. Maybe now they see it in practice on their own doorstep. They might see what they're missing and start learning. Go back to school. Preparing to tell allies hard truths, refusing easy populist slogans. He challenged the room to be consistent in its defense of international law, whether in Kyiv or Gaza. And the President's economic message was equally significant. He noted with a hint of irony that while Brexit was regrettable, Trade between Britain and France has actually surpassed pre-Brexit levels. He praised the 3,500 French companies employing Britons and offered the prospect of fresh investment in energy and space cooperation. Crucially, he warned both countries against excessive dependency on the US and China. And in doing so, he was not indulging in anti-Americanism, but advocating strategic autonomy, a more resilient and balanced economic partnership. Macron also gave the speech a personal, even playful touch. He announced that France will loan the Bayeux Tapestry to Britain, a remarkable act of cultural diplomacy. The tapestry, a symbol of conquest, becomes instead a gift of reconciliation and mutual respect. He joked that the loan deal had taken longer to conclude than the entire Brexit text, charming the room while underlining the long labour of rebuilding trust. In his closing words, hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, this is our common destiny, Macron reached for an old but necessary ideal fraternity. His achievement today was to give form and substance to that ideal, to remind Britain that even outside the European Union it cannot leave Europe. He challenged the UK to renew an alliance forged in the trenches of 2 world wars, tested by Brexit, and now urgently needed in a world riven by war, by climate change and technological disruption. This was not empty rhetoric. It was a vision for an entente not just cordial, but essential. Long live France, long live the United Kingdom. Bravo to President Macron.